Before we begin today's episode of Intellectual Catholicism, I want to give a shout out to a friend of mine, Brad Geist and his wife, who are both fans of the show and run an awesome business called Benedict's Beads. If you go to their website, you can see they offer a wide variety of handmade rosaries and other Catholic gifts. But in particular, they specialize in what's known as a latterized rosary. So when I first entered the church, I was familiar with this kind of standard issue rosary. But latterization makes your rosary go from this into this, a beautifully reinforced rosary that's a great gift and something that I know that I'm going to be praying with in the future. Even right now, I'm working on their website to customize my own rosary. This is super exciting stuff. They build a strong rosary that you can customize, that you can design, and they repair any broken rosaries that you have. This is an awesome Catholic business run by a growing family, and I highly recommend that all my viewers check them out. Welcome to this episode of Intellectual Catholicism. Today I'm here with Erick Ybarra to discuss his new papacy book published by Emmaus Publishing or Emmaus Road Publishing. Erick, this is a wonderful, remarkable achievement. And I just want to highlight too for everybody that I have my author signed copy right here. Super excited. I mean, this is your Christmas present to me, Erick, and to really the whole church. And so I just want to thank you for all the work you put into this. So how the reception, how has it been so far? How do you feel about the work and everything you put into it?
Yeah, Suan, thank you for having me on. I really appreciate those kind words, and I'm glad to have shared this, at the culmination of the holiday season here.
Mm-hmm.
And the reception has been enormously generous and kind. Many people have given me a lot of compliments. I've had a lot of people reading it very fast. I was just on Erick Salmon's show, Crisis Magazine podcast, and he's already at page like 500 something. And a few others. One historian friend of mine is halfway through it. Another one of my close friends who's a history buff, theology nerd, like myself, and he's halfway through it just about. And I'm just happy. One person told me it was a page turner, which is the last thing I thought this was going to be. What I thought this book was going to be used for is if a Catholic or an Orthodox or a Protestant comes across a topic about the papacy in the first millennium, then they'll take the book off the shelf and then flip to that chapter about that, and then put it quickly back on the shelf after they're done reading that section. So the fact that people are reading from the beginning all the way, I was quite taken back by that.
Right. It was either that or it would be used as a door stopper, right?
Yeah. I had one guy, the host of Sensus Fidelium, say that he needs his back brace when he has to lift this thing up.
Erick, just to go off script a little bit, I know I have the questions I sent you, but for those who have been following, your blog posts for years, would it be the case that they would find, the book manuscript, if you will, scattered around in those blog posts, or is there really new original content in this book?
I think there is a lot of new original content in the book. Yeah. Yes, definitely. There's going to be a lot of echoes, a lot of things that I've said in my blog posts are going to come out in the book. Some things I've said in my blog posts that perhaps I don't agree with anymore. So, there's also that. But certainly those, people who have read through my blog, they can hear me in the book. I've been told that. So.
Well, Erick, that sounds wonderful. So, I think you mentioned that the original manuscript for the book was like 1,100 pages or something like that. And I believe now it's been reduced down to a healthy 762 pages. So if I might ask, of the content that was removed or kind of, let's say shaved off, was any of that content, I don't want to say was it really essential, because obviously if it was really essential, it would be in the book. I mean, what kinds of things were cut out? Was it just for the sake of editing and brevity, or was it
Yeah, yeah,
anything substantial?
yeah. So there was a few things that were just completely removed, right?
Mm-hmm.
And then there was other things that were shortened,
Mm.
summarized. But the things that were removed were a number of. I made a number of extra chapters at the end of the book. Certain things just deserve to be an appendix
Mm-hmm.
rather than in the main body. One of those was trying to help readers understand the uh, the convocation at Chieti between the two commissions for ecumenical dialogue between Catholics and Orthodox. It often comes up today um, following the Ravenna document from 2007, the Chieti document, which was released, I want to say 2014, 15, or 16. I can't remember. But that document, it almost appears as though the Catholic side of the commission of the dialogue basically just gave way and just said that, the Eastern Orthodox are right about the history of the papacy. It was not true, wasn't accepted, didn't have any jurisdiction over the East, and that ecumenical councils are only ecumenical by they're only validly recognized as ecumenical when the whole church receives it. And so some Catholics read that, and they're like, "Wow, well, that just sounds like we just handed over every last animal on the farm." And some Orthodox use it as a way to say, "Hey, look, you guys already have admitted it, but you're just not going all the way with, admitting that you are the schism. You're the one who's guilty of the schism." And of course, Protestants use it as a way to show that Rome is wrong and that the and so it's just a mess. So I had to take out that whole appendix,
Mm.
and I made it free on academia.edu, so you can actually go read it under my academia.edu page. Just look for one of the entries whose title includes Chieti.
Mm.
The other one was I made another appendix having to do with the Pope Benedict XVI, emeritus, when he was a theologian and priest, Father Joseph Ratzinger, and also when he was the prefect for the CDF. He's made a number of statements in various publications of his since really the 60s. Throughout the decades, he's made statements that have sounded as if um, he too is saying that the Orthodox are right about the Catholic Church and the papacy, and that it's a late development, wasn't there in the beginning, and that the first 1,000 years, the Orthodox are the ones that have been faithful to that, whereas the Catholics come in with their developments in the second millennium. And so I have heard mainly from friends of mine sending me snippets from Orthodox audios saying, "Hey, look, Ratzinger himself, Pope Benedict XVI himself, has basically said that the Catholics have been wrong. The Orthodox are the ones that are faithful to the first millennium." So I wrote a chapter that turned into an appendix showing what was Ratzinger's view about the Byzantine Orthodox Church, the Greek split, and what he thought about their views in the first millennium, what he thought about the Catholic view in the second millennium. Were all the rumors correct? Is he being correctly interpreted? So I detailed all kinds of statements from Ratzinger showing quite the opposite. But it just gave too much space to the book. And so I took that out. It was kind of like cutting an artery to me, because that is such a, I think it is something that's like a talking point now, right? But that's free on academia.edu as well.
Praise God.
Yeah. So I reconciled it in my head, and I just said, well, I'll just keep telling people that it's free. You can read it on academia. And that way, maybe people will read that and it'll perk their interest in the book, perhaps,
Mm-hmm.
you know. So I saw that there was some pros to overcome the cons. Um, then there was another appendix on Pope Vigilius
Mm.
and the complication that his papacy creates for the doctrine of the papacy, and this one gets real deep into the weeds. I had to split it into two different chapters actually, um, and it was just perhaps too over the top for a book like this, especially for my first book being published with ERP, Emmaus Road Publishing.
Mm-hmm.
And uh, it turns out that, you know, of the two departments, Emmaus Academic, Emmaus Road, they decided to go with Emmaus Road because it would be hard to sell this to seminaries as a course,
Mm.
because there's not so much a course just for the East-West debate. So they decided to put it with the Department of ERP, which means it's for everybody to read.
Mm.
The wider audience, and because of that, we don't want to make it too difficult, you know. So I also took out those two appendix and made them free on academia. And they're unedited in a way, so there's some typos and things. But if people want to know what I think about the Vigilius events, they could see that there on academia. So those are the things that were completely removed. Of the things that were shortened, the chapter on epistemology,
Yeah.
the epistemological considerations, that was almost twice the size,
Mm.
perhaps even more than that originally, because I think that is the one thing that has been overlooked in the past when it comes to addressing the Catholic Orthodox dialogue. You know, you see those publications back in the 1800s, early 1900s. You've got these catinas and florilegium of church father citations going back and forth, back and
Mm-hmm.
forth, back and forth. And in the 20th century, by the 70s, things start to become more mature. But what I've noticed now in this past decade is we've overlooked the issue of epistemology and what the difference that we have in looking at how truth is discerned
Mm-hmm.
between Orthodox and Catholics. And I was just intrigued by the differences that exist in Orthodox theology, but in particular, Alexei Khomyakov, who was a Russian Slavophilic, you know, pioneer thinker, on trying to assess what the epistemological differences are between Latins and Greeks when it comes to doctrine and the schism. And I enjoyed his writing so much. You know, I read him in reliable translation, but I've also read some of the secondary commentaries on him. There's also some other various monographs on Russian philosophy and epistemology on the faith, and I wanted to put so much more into that chapter, but I had to find a way to shorten it because it would have been a book of its own, really.
Yeah.
You know, so that epistemological considerations is a much shortened version of what I'd like to say on that. Needless to say, I summarized it adequately. You know, the differences are overblown. There's a lot of middle ground to meet at with Catholics and Orthodox on that spectrum. And the other thing that was shortened quite a bit was the section on I want to say the Vigilius. I had a chapter on the Fifth Council. That one also had to be short quite a bit. My introduction was way too long originally. Yeah, so I think that pretty much covers everything. Once you shortened everything down from that, it went from 1,100 around to that back down to 700, 50 pages or so.
Mm-hmm. I mean, and regardless, you still spend 100 pages setting up the rest of the book, with the epistemology, the scriptures, consensus patrum, all these other issues that we'll briefly touch.
Yeah.
So definitely nothing I would say is let's say essentially substantially missing from your presentation. I still think it's quite comprehensive.
Thank you. Yeah, I'm hoping that's the case. I think it is.
So, getting now into the book itself, what are the four claims that must be true in order for Catholic ecclesiology to prevail? And I believe it's in the introduction where you spell this out quite clearly.
Yeah. So in the book, I propose that we have to sit back and agree on what would be considered valid evidence, because this is also one of those things that's related to epistemology that Catholics and Orthodox don't often talk about. And so halfway through the competitions and all the debates, the Orthodox are saying, well, that's not Vatican I, so you still haven't hit the mark, right? And then the Catholics are saying, well, what are you talking about? That's a substantial idea that necessarily implies Vatican I, right? So, and they're both kind of like not seeing the point there. But the first basic thing is that I don't think that Catholics and Orthodox need to agree that Christ established a supreme power in the apostles. I think that the Orthodox, the Catholics can agree on that. Of course, there are some Orthodox that like the language of that. I try to accommodate that by just saying that they have a teaching authority. There's a magisterium of sorts there in the apostles. But the first thing that really needs to be there is that Christ singles out St. Peter. Okay, within that body of governance, St. Peter is singled out and given a unique leadership position as it relates to the mission of that hierarchy. So, Catholics and Orthodox we can all agree that Peter was the head of the apostles, the chief, the coryphaeus, the caput apostolorum, the head of the apostles. So that something like that needs to be there. Okay, that's the first thing. The second thing that needs to be there is that that this office has it has jurisdictional implications. It's not just in other words, even if you don't want to talk about the word jurisdiction, right? Because the apostles didn't mention that. I think the only time the word jurisdiction comes up in the New Testament is when it's referring to Herod's coverage, over the civil land. So we want to contrast St. Peter's position with something like moral influence merely, where he's just sort of like he holds a position of, where he is sort of like an example, and it can instigate ideas, but he can't effectively promulgate anything when it comes to teaching authority, discipline, or anything carrying the effect of a command. And so that position of headship that Christ singles out Peter for has to have this authoritative character within the apostolic college. So that's the second thing. The third thing that needs to be there is that that office of headship given to St. Peter, which has authoritative character, it does not die with him. Okay, so it outlives the human being, St. Peter himself, right? And so that's, it outlives him in a lineal succession, and not just it's not a free floating mobility where it just kind of goes wherever it goes. It has a fixed address for this depository where that headship redounds to. And so that's the third thing. The fourth thing is that it has to be understood that that office of headship given to St. Peter, and which has authoritative character, and which comes down through a lineal succession, is part of the DNA of the church. Mm. And so it has to be consubstantial with the church's mission at its founding and all the way until the end of time. So, you know, those four things. I didn't bring up the word jurisdiction. I didn't bring up the modifications to that of immediacy or immediate, or, you know, mediated, or direct or indirect. Didn't bring up infallibility. Didn't bring up any of those things. And the reason why I think that this is sufficient, these four things are sufficient to basically prove the papacy, or sufficiently, because there's different kinds of evidence. In the book, I talk about different kinds of evidence, you know, and also when you present evidence for something, it's not that each piece of the evidence has to be conclusive. Mm-hmm. It could be that there's accumulation that makes it to the target, right? Well, there's no other religion out there that believes in this kind of Petrine architecture for the faith, for the Christian church. The only living society that is a Christian community that lives today and that has any chance of showing a pedigree of having existed in history is the Catholic Church, that has this Petrine architecture. I call it Petrine architecture because it's something embedded into the blueprints of the church. Mm-hmm. So those four things have to match reality. Mm-hmm. And the only match made would be the Catholic Church. You know, so I think if you can get those 4 points across, number one, it would show that the Eastern Orthodox Church, whose ecclesiology and theology don't match those 4 points, that they would be disqualified, but also that the only church that does exist today, assuming that Christ's promise is not false, would be the Catholic Church. Mm. But then also, I also mentioned that the issue of immediate jurisdiction, direct jurisdiction, universality of jurisdiction, as well as papal infallibility and supremacy, those things are naturally implied by those four principles. That's a different point. It takes more work to get there, but that's where I start with those 4 points. And I don't think those 4 points substantially need to be added to. I think that those 4 points just need to be unpacked to get to Vatican I, if that makes sense. Yeah.
Right. So it's not that you're going into the book saying, here's the Vatican I view. Now I'm going to show you in the history of the church where you see the Vatican I stuff really come out all together. What you're really trying to show is, okay, here are like 4 main propositions that, you know, are enough to at least show you that the Eastern Orthodox position is not correct on ecclesiology, right? And these 4 propositions are enough where you can say, well, they actually fit a lot better, or rather the Catholic Church is ecclesiology, fits a lot better with these 4 propositions. It's not saying that you're going to get all the little specifics of supremacy, infallibility, and immediate jurisdiction and what have you, universality, but the Catholic ecclesiology matches these 4 really well substantiated points.
Yes, and I think that the distance that you'd have to close from those 4 points and the dogmatic constitution on the church at Vatican I is not really that great. You know, right. Mm-hmm. There might be some options there that are alternatives, but through scrutiny, I think they do get kind of they become incredible. You know, but yeah, you're right. I'm not trying to just jump to that. I'm trying to show that you know, we don't need to do that. You know, we can kind of start at a much more simplified form and then work from there. You know?
And before we get to the next question, I think it's also just worth kind of reflecting on these 4 claims, because I think they're really important, right, to understanding going forward, you know, what you're doing and what you're saying. Because I think in particular, when you talk about how, for example, the Petrine headship is not mobile, right? So it's not the
Right.
case that, for example, wow, the Patriarch of Jerusalem in our generation is really the bastion of Orthodoxy. And so that's where Peter is. And then
Right.
let's say the next generation, you see the Patriarch of Constantinople is really the bastion of Orthodoxy. That's where Peter is now, so we're
Right.
trying to avoid that. And then when you said that, this headship, this authoritative lineal succession headship from the Petrine character is consubstantial with the church.
Yes.
The idea is that this isn't something that we practically developed because we needed a head, right? We're saying it was there, at least in the, as you put it, the DNA of the church itself. Is that a fair way of understanding the consubstantiality point, or is there more that you want to say there?
Yes, because between Catholics and Orthodox, we're both conscious of things like this that are etched into the DNA. So, for example, like the episcopal government of the church, that a church is consisting of essentially the bishop and the people.
Mm-hmm.
The church is in the bishop is in the church. That kind of indissolubility between ecclesia and episkopos is not something that the church artificially created. It's something that she received and which she cannot let go of. So the Orthodox Church can't gather in an ecumenical council and say, all right, by the year 2024, we want to get rid of this thing called bishop. They can't do that because it's etched into their understanding of the church's DNA. So in the same way, this unified singularity of a headship office over the universal church, having Petrine succession, all the criteria I said, that is not something that is built upon a sense of need. It's built upon the fact that it was received and can't be let go, regardless of the complications that come with it. Because we could all agree it comes with some complications.
Right. Well, going forward then, we touched on this a little bit, but you have your 4 claims here. How much evidence do we need in order to be, let's say, justified or confident in these propositions? For example, one common rule that you'll see being used is the rule of St. Vincent, or the consensus patrum, the thing that was believed everywhere at all times by all peoples, right, by all in the church. Maybe that's the rule that we should be expecting for your 4 claims to really be verified by. Is that the rule we should use, or?
So I answered yes and no. So it's kind of like, yes, we have to, there has to be something about what St. Vincent is talking about. But at the same time, it can't be so rigid, because when you get too rigid with it, then we're all decapitated. Both the Catholic and the Orthodox don't have a claim anymore. So because, and I say this not just because, St. Vincent was inadequate, that's not what I want to say. But St. Vincent's intention may have been more broad than specific. So this is one of the reasons why at the beginning of the book, I talk about Catholics and Orthodox agreeing to the source material. Because if I make a really good case for the papacy, but I do it from sources that the Orthodox don't accept,
right?
They can just say, well, that's a really good structural argument, but I don't accept the premise. I don't accept the source material, right? So I wanted to make sure that, we're both on the same foot with scripture, sacred scripture, sacred tradition, okay? And then the consensus patrum, which is very, I chose to capitalize on that because in Orthodoxy, that's such a major issue. Catholics and Orthodox don't have debates in the Bible like Catholics and Protestants do.
Right.
The territorial field of battle between Catholics and Orthodox is in the consensus of the fathers and the councils, right? So I wanted to make sure that I would be building my case from the data in those sources that the Orthodox have already said they cannot question. So That's number one. Where is the source material? Number two, what kind of evidence you're asking? What's sufficient evidence? How much is enough evidence? Well, we have to be fair. I don't mention this explicitly in the book right off the bat, but I wish I would have. Iconology, for example. When the Orthodox want to find evidence that iconology, veneration of icons, and that whole structure of theology is apostolic and traditional, they'll go to a father who just mentions pictures, and they'll say, well, if we're generous and reasonable, we can see how this can be developed. All right, well, using the same kind of predictable trajectory, a predictable trajectory. We go in. What do we have to find about the papacy? Well, if somebody just says something like, if somebody says, well, the Cappadocians believed that there was one ousia between Father, Son, and Holy Spirit, how do they prove that? Well, they go in there and they find a statement where the two Gregories or Basil says that, right? So, well, if that's the case, then we could do the same thing. We don't have to find an activity where a pope puts his foot down against all these competitors and wins against the church. That would be too far. That would be such an egregious expectation for evidence. If somebody just comes out and says, well, Christ handed the keys to St. Peter and all of his successors governed the church in all places, that's evidence. That makes it to the table. Mm-hmm. Just like every other statement in support of Christology, iconology, the triadology, ecclesiology, like St. Ignatius, do nothing without the bishop. Mm. He's not pointing, hey, Bishop so-and-so said this and nobody contested him. Uh-huh. That's how we know that the bishop has jurisdiction. No, he just says don't do anything without the bishop because he holds the place of God. Mm. It's just a claim, and that makes it to the table. That's acceptable for Orthodox, for Anglicans, and for Catholics when it comes to the mono-episcopate. Right? Mm. So if we're just being fair, we can all things like that in relation to those four things I spoke about with St. Peter: succession, universality, authority. Anything that makes it to the level where it's pointing in that direction, either hinting or full blown, is adequate evidence. I try to stick with what's just full blown. I do, because we only have so much space, right? So I try to stick with the clearest. But so yeah, I think that if the fathers and the councils just say things that can only mean those four things together, then that's neither the Catholic nor the Orthodox has a right to question. Just like we wouldn't have a right to question the Cappadocians when they teach one single ousia just because they claimed it, or that the power of the bishop who has jurisdiction in his local church. We don't need to find a demanding bishop who gets his way all the time. We could just say that, look, this is how the church believed the bishop's office to be. Well, we only need to look at statements describing the office of the Roman pontiff as the chair of Peter and what its attending and associated characteristics are. If we just find descriptions, that makes it to the table for evidence. Now, of course, it's great when we see it in action and we see that people are abiding by it and that their people are recognizing the need to be subordinate to that for the glory of God. Those are things that I definitely bring up in the book. But I don't think that is the only thing that should be accepted as evidence.
I really like your definition of evidence because once, as you said before, it's not the claim that this particular datum proves conclusively all the claims that we need for the papacy, because that's not usually how we even use evidence in the first place. We notice that something points in the direction, let's say more plausibly than not, at something else. It makes sense with the data. Maybe it's expected by the hypothesis. And then when we do the final analysis and we put all the pieces together, it seems to really favor one conclusion over another.
Yeah.
So yeah, I think that's a really good nuance. Now, as we go forward, you describe in the book two different ecclesiologies that developed. And especially, I think you have a whole chapter dedicated to the concept of primacy in the Orthodox Church. And so it might be worth here just discussing then, as we look at hypotheses, if you will, what were the differing ecclesiologies that arose? What really distinguished, let's say, East and West on this particular issue?
Yeah. So this is an area where, me as a um, I have to, be careful making my own theories on history. I don't have a PhD in history, so I had to sort of submit to the scholarship on this. Most scholars today recognize that there was basically some sort of growing divergence happening between the East and the West. Um, I don't think it's as overblown as some scholars think it is, but I think that the general consensus is that the West ended up surrounding the the Bishop of Rome in a way that the Eastern bishops eventually felt was extreme, and that's covering the 1,000 years. So eventually, at the end of 1,000 years, it's definitely the Greek Byzantine, the Greek hierarchy ends up seeing the claims of the Roman pontiff as extreme. Now, I think nobody denies that. But you could see them already kind of veering in that direction a few times, more than a few times, within the 1,000 years. It is true that every single controversy related to the seven ecumenical councils, with the exception of the first two, is the East, something gets hatched in the East, a heresy gets hatched in the East, it gets debated about in the East. But then Rome is sort of called upon to resolve the matter. And in all of those instances, Rome was very forceful about its position and its expectations. And the Greek bishops often thought it was a little over the top. Even when they decided to acquiesce, you can tell just by some of the preamble, some of the preliminary discussions that they were a little shocked, at times. And then at other times when they really needed the papacy, then they kind of, were willing to shine the Pope's shoes. In other words, for lack of a better term, they were willing to, let him say what he's going to say about his office. We need him. Just get him here, and we'll. It seems to me that exists there, and of course, when we say East and West, we're talking about those churches that enjoyed communion in the first millennium. You had a lot of Eastern bishops that were willing to walk away from the papacy altogether. Some people in the past have been severely critical of my work on Pope St. Leo and his tome and the Council of Chalcedon. And so some people make a big hype about how at the council, the tome of Leo was, tested and reviewed, and it was doubted. And then they had to do, they had to have commissions on whether it was Orthodox or not. And which, in my opinion, and I express in the book, I think that's all mythology. But even if I was to say, you know what, let's ignore the facts and let's just go ahead and admit that. Let's just go ahead and admit that the Greeks that's how they handled the tome, that they were just, it was severely criticized. After the Council of Chalcedon, many of those bishops that were critical of the tome, let's just say, they were equally critical of the council itself. So if we're going to say, well, the criticism that they had on the tome shows that they didn't think that the Pope had authority a priori, right? Well, the same would have to apply to the council then, because many bishops in Egypt and Syria And we're not talking about insignificant portions. We're talking about significant portions of bishops rejected the Council of Chalcedon. Well, that would have to also mean that the bishops there did not believe that a council had the authority to bind their conscience either. Mm. And then what's left? There's not many answers left, right? Rome's position was very clear. No, it stopped when the Pope dropped his pen. That's where it stopped. That's where the debate stopped. And it just so happens, as we move into the next century, the Eastern bishops had to recognize that, because of when the emperor told Pope Hormisdas, "Hey, we're dying here. We're dehydrated. Everybody here doesn't know what to believe. Pope Hormisdas, what do we do?" Mm-hmm. And he sends over a formula, which basically says everything that the popes have been claiming since Leo is true. And they signed. So you end up seeing in the post-history of Chalcedon that the tome actually, its fame gets vindicated. So you do see this divergence, but what I sense is that the Eastern bishops never got away with rejecting the papacy, and the papacy never accepted its rejection.
I think it was it Father? I'm trying to remember if it was Father Price. I forgot his first name. Was it Vincent or Richard?
Richard, yeah, right. Reverend Dr. Richard Price, yeah.
I remember somebody brought up a quote from his about, like, when he was giving the summary of the relations between the East and West, and basically his position, I think, and this is me giving a rough estimation, it was something like, the East only consulted Rome on a practical level when it really needed help, right? To get some moral support or to have the Pope weigh in as a last resort, and it didn't. A lot of people are using this quote as evidence against, your work and other people's, the Catholic position that, well, no, I mean, Rome was not really recognized as having any unique divine institution. It was just for practical reasons, right? And I know that you've engaged that, but I think it's worth then going to this next question, which is, did the East ever recognize the papal claims? Was it the case that the East, the East as this monolith, right, totally was right. Eastern ecclesiology as opposed to the Western ecclesiology, which only the West had? Or were there times where the East very clearly, in significant terms, let's say not just kind of, with their, their faces down, twiddling their thumbs, saying, okay, right, we accept the papal claims?
Yeah, I think there are, like I've told you, like I said earlier, the Orthodox have, the Orthodox and the Roman Catholics, the Catholic Church, we hit a gold mine with figures like Basil, Gregory of Nazianzus, Gregory of Nyssa, Augustine of Hippo, all these people. And much of their theological claims are taken for the view of the church. Like at the Fifth Ecumenical Council, for example, it solemnly says, we accept all of the 4 previous ecumenical synods, and we also uphold Augustine, Chrysostom, Basil, Gregory. So even individual church fathers and their writings were canonized in a sense. It's not that they themselves were a priori infallible, but because of how much they've been received into the church, they're now basically on the shelf of canon, and so the views that certain Eastern fathers share about the whole papal architecture, that of those 4 points with St. Peter down to the Roman pontiff, it's just so abundantly clear that some significant voices in the East did accept that. And if the church fathers are on the shelf of canonical authority, then we could go to those names and say, well, this is what they said about the Roman pontiff. That must mean that the East, through the voice of this particular figure who has been accepted as an ecumenical figure, that suffices to make a definition for what the East accepted. You see what I'm saying? So I think that several Eastern fathers, like Saint Maximus the Confessor,
Right.
um, uh, you know, Saint Theodore the Studite, Saint Nicephorus of Constantinople, Saint Flavian of Constantinople, Saint Athanasius in the fourth century. I mean, some of these names are the highly regarded figures at very sensitive and important times in Byzantine history. What they say about the papacy, I think, needs to be reckoned with. So that's that. Then there's also what the East accepted in the platform of an ecumenical council.
Right.
Now, it's not a secret that the Orthodox have a much more I'm trying to find a word for this. Okay, the phrase conciliar fundamentalism is actually used in academia, so it's not a slurred term to describe how the Eastern Orthodox view ecumenical councils. But it's not a secret that the Orthodox tend to see the ecumenical councils as kind of like inspired, like not extra sheets of Holy Scripture, but basically, practically extra sheets of Scripture. They have their ways of making those distinctions, I'm sure. But they attribute that to every last word of the council, and this is something that is quite proven in how the debates took their form in the first millennium. And so let's get right to it. The tome of Pope St. Agatho to the Sixth Ecumenical Council. If anybody reads that letter that's Pope St. Agatho wrote to the Council of Constantinople in 681, and I don't just mean like the snippet on Duet, I'm talking about if you get the full letter and read it from the beginning to the end, you will see claims to papal supremacy and papal infallibility that dwarf Vatican I. They do. They do. Because Vatican I's much more qualified. Agatho's far more general than specific. His genus to species ratio is not, it's not as much as the Vatican Council or Pasteur Eternus. So I recommend anyone who's listening go and get the Shaft, the collection of Shafts, the pre-Nicene, Nicene, post-Nicene Fathers set, the one called Ecumenical Councils. You can actually get the full letter of Agatho in English in that volume. Now, okay, somebody might say, okay, well, what I'm hearing you say, Erick, is that was a letter from the Pope. Well, of course, the Pope's going to say what. Okay, but hold on a second. Okay, when the council, and this is replete in the literature for Orthodox, when a council takes on a letter from somebody else, an individual, whether it's Cyril of Alexandria, Athanasius, Sophronius of Jerusalem, Pope Leo, it doesn't matter. When a pope takes a letter from an individual, reads it out loud bilingually for the Greeks and the Latins, and then says, this is the faith of the apostles, God has spoken, and then everyone votes on it, that letter now becomes the voice of the council. Do you see what I'm saying? It becomes now it becomes consubstantial with the content of the council, as if the council is speaking what the letter says. And so when they received Agatho's letter, that was a conciliar absorption of the content of what Agatho wrote. So it's unmistakable to me that the East accepted basically everything in the logic of Vatican I just because of that acceptance of the letter of Agatho. Now, somebody might say, well, the bishops at the Greek council there, they may have, the emperor was forcing them, and they knew that their options were exile or submit to the thumb of Rome because the emperor made that clear. My response to that is, if an ecumenical council is going to be reliable, we can't go by what their hidden feelings were.
Mhm.
We have to go by the laws of the council, which is what's in the Acts. What is written in the Acts? What are the words facing up to the ceiling on the paper? That is what matters. So if we're following those criteria, I think the East did accept, we said 3 times, formula for business. You did a whole show on that recently, so I won't go into that. The Agatho letter to Constantinople. The third one I would say is Pope Hadrian's letters to Nicaea too, and I've also done a show with you on that before. Again, similar to Agatho, just replete with papal claims to papal supremacy, papal infallibility, based off the Petrine architecture. So going all the way back to the New Testament, to the Matthean Commission, the Johannine Commission, and the Lucan promise of divine and perpetual assistance. This is New Testament theology that Hadrian's writing in his letters about the perpetual role and function of the Roman pontiff as the heir of St. Peter. And that gets accepted in the same way by the bishops at the Seventh Ecumenical Council. So whether they were happy about it, whether they liked it, whether they didn't, I happen to believe they did like it, because based on their responses, they were quite ecstatic about what the Pope was writing. I don't think we need to be too skeptical about their motives. I mean, we're talking about godly men here. We're not supposed to be presuming that they're being lawyers and, having second thoughts and double motives and things like that. If we're going to give them the benefit of the doubt, then what they accepted at the council as a written part of the Acts is what their heart also believed. If we're going to say, well, their heart really wasn't into it because we know that this happened afterwards and this happened before, well, now we've basically lost all sense of navigation on what the people believed in the first millennium, because what they wrote down might not ever match what their real heart says. So yeah, I think those 3 points, and there's plenty more. I mean, I go through it in the book. There's plenty more, but I think those are 3 highlights.
Yeah, Eric, I mean, the work that you're doing is incredible. And it makes me go back to when I was starting on apologetics and doing the work on the papacy. And because I was, as a Protestant, or as a former Protestant, more familiar with the scriptures. And then when people ask me about the fathers, I was kind of like, I don't know, 50-50 maybe. But I think what you're showing is, no, I mean, there's a very substantial voice in the history of the church saying the papal claims are true. This is not like, you having to really lawyer and exegete super hard, if you will, to make all the pieces fit. You're saying, here are the pieces. They're right there. To some extent.
And I think that with you mentioning that, it calls due attention from myself to atone perhaps of certain things I've said in the past, like there's that the Catholic side wins by a bird's eyelash or something like that. What because I've had a lot of people, just like, what are you serious? Like, it's that. I'm like, okay, let me clarify, okay, for your audience, and I request to God that whoever else, perhaps the audience will be large who sees this video. What I mean by that is not that it's like, you've got half the time people are teaching the papacy, half the time people are teaching what the Orthodox are saying. What I mean is that there's an enormous amount of evidence, like we're talking about here, for the papacy. But there are like 2 or 3 events, which is not much, right? That's not compared to all the other events that happened in the first millennium. There are 2 or 3 events that really, really it challenges the papacy. It would kind of be like the Old and New Testament, the doctrine of inerrancy, when there's like 2 or 3 verses where it's really hard to really prove inerrancy, but you can, with some effort and some generous qualifications and trust in the Lord, right? So it's the same way. I think, like, the papacy has I wrote a whole book on it. I think there's a lot of evidence for it, but there are a few instances that really put the fire to the feet, that it comes close to a falsification event. I don't think it is. But so just in light of those few things, that's why I said that the papacy wins by like an alfalfa hair coming in at the finish line. But that is very misleading. I have to admit.
No, I appreciate you saying that and kind of including all the qualifications into, that's very important. Yeah. Well, speaking of those falsification events, you'll often hear Pope Honorius and Vigilius mentioned.
Oh, yeah.
And I mean, I know that there's a lot that can be said. I mean, you even wrote, dozens and dozens of pages on these particular figures. What would you want to say here just briefly about why these two instances aren't fatal or falsifications?
Yeah, well, so if I'm at a round table with atheists and New Testament scholars who are Hindus and Buddhists and New Age, and we've got Baptists and Anglicans and Catholic. If I'm at the round table with just a whole gamut of, religio-philosophical views, Honorius and Vigilius are really hard scenarios. But between Catholics and Orthodox, it's not as difficult because you have events before Honorius, like Chalcedon, Pope Leo, the formula of Hormisdas, right? You have all these like very strong indicators that the papacy is true. Then you've got Vigilius and Honorius. And then right after them, you also got this onslaught of things that are really strong evidence for the papacy being true at the 6th and 7th ecumenical councils. So it's almost like the Vigilius and Honorius events are like they're sandwiched in between very strong indicators of both East and West accepting the papacy.
Right.
So what that tells us is, just from a bird's eye view, rather than getting into the wood of a tree at the forest, is that if we're going to keep the first millennium consensus patrons walking on two legs, reconciling these two figures with the two huge loaves of bread on top of them and beneath them is more preferable. Because if we're going to say that those two things basically destroy the papacy, we're not just saying something about Honorius and Vigilius and Roman Catholicism. We're also shooting arrows right back into retrospectively back into the ecumenical acceptance of the papacy before Vigilius and Honorius. And we're saying, well, why did Maximus the Confessor make such bold claims about the papacy if just 94 years before Vigilius messed up the whole thing? So for some reason, Maximus didn't think the whole institution was defunct. So that means that whatever happened with Vigilius is compatible with a continuation of the basic claims of the papacy. Does that make sense?
Yeah, and you're saying that if you accept like a rupture interpretation, where, okay, you might have had the claims made big time before and after, but you got to look at the rupture that happened in between that breaks the link, then you're saying, at least for someone who's Orthodox, that is going to come back to bite you in a lot of ways.
Yeah, because it rubs, the sword rubs on one side for us, but it also rubs on the other side for them. Because now they're also cutting into their own acceptation of the theory and practice of the papacy. So the Vigilius Honorius event, if the sword penetrates into the Catholic view of the papacy, it only does so right after it's also pierced through the consensus patron of the Eastern Fathers. And so what you have there is double homicide, you know. So that's why I made the contrast between a round table with Catholics and Orthodox versus a round table with people of every kind of religio-philosophical view, because somebody who's a Buddhist and a New Testament I just had an interview with Dr. Tia Kolbaba, who is she doesn't profess any religion. She's a Byzantinist. Well, she could just say, well, I'm not Orthodox or Catholic, so I have every right to say that the Honorius event and the Vigilius event destroyed the papacy, because I don't care what the collateral damage is.
Right.
But if we're going to talk about the debate between Catholics and Orthodox,
Mm-hmm.
well, now the collateral damage actually does matter.
Right.
And so we have to be attentive. We have to be attendant to what that damage might be, depending on how severe we want to make these events out to be.
Yeah, and I want to just emphasize that, I mean, literally the subtitle of the book is, revisiting the debate between Catholics and Orthodox. So your audience is primarily, Catholics and Orthodox who are in dialogue, who are, relatively familiar, or at least getting familiar with the apologetics of what's going on here. So even a Protestant coming in, hearing, oh, well, the Catholic and the Orthodox side are both going to suffer great, like there goes,
yes.
yeah, okay, sure. Then we're not necessarily appealing to Protestants here in this particular examination of the first millennium that you're doing.
That's right. If I was gonna be addressing the Protestant, I'd have to be far more careful. I'd have to be, I'd have to, maximize on those areas where the Protestant suffers, and from our perspective.
Mm-hmm.
So some of these things that I do talk about in the book, as I explain at the end of the book, is if we're going to go all the way with the rejection of the papacy, then I think both Catholicism and Eastern Orthodox become not perhaps falsified, at the very least severely diminished in credibility, because all the sources that we share definitely give evidence to the papacy.
Mm-hmm.
So if the papacy is false, then that kind of poisons it makes incredible our pool of data, of the source data. So a Protestant could look in from the outside in and say, so Erick's at least, he's admitting that, he's admitting he's having a Luther event. Popes, councils, fathers, every one of them can err. Scripture beats them all, So if I was writing for a Protestant audience, I'd have to be attentive to responding to that possible, they might use that against me. So
right, and then at that point, then the book would also become 1,100 pages, justifiably.
I'm actually in the works of writing a book, not like this, but maybe like 100 pages.
Oh, okay.
Dealing with the Anglicans, because that's where I come from.
Yeah.
So the Anglicans, a lot of Anglicans out there who read this is going to be like a hot fudge chocolate sundae, because they're going to be like, oh, see, the papacy might have been true, but there's still some evidence against it. So it kind of justifies the way the Church of England responded. Well, God willing, I have a 100-page answer for that soon.
Nice. All right. That's awesome. I'm looking forward to that. Yeah. Erick, let's get to some last few questions and then we can wrap it up for the night.
Yeah.
Near the end of the book, you start talking about the concept of papal failure and the ex cathedra conditioning. And somebody might say at this point, well, Erick, you mentioned the concept of papal failure, the ex cathedra conditioning. I've heard this claim a lot personally in my own papacy apologetics work. But people will say, well, that just shows you the Catholics are making it up as they go along. And now they make their theory unfalsifiable, right? What's your response to at least that reaction? And, you don't have to give a lecture, right? But what's some general responses you'd give?
Yeah. So the first thing I would say, and the strongest thing I'd say, is that we can't be making it up, because all we're trying to do is reconcile the data with itself. We're trying to reconcile the New Testament and the church's traditional interpretation of the Bible in its life of tradition and councils. The councils exhibit a clear profession of this institution in St. Peter, and that it's supposed to live on through his successors, and that the purpose of it is, with this character symbolized in the keys of the kingdom, binding and loosing authority, for the well-being and unity of the church. Those are things that have been handed to us, you see. So just like scientists would say, well, we have to be faithful to certain things that we know are true, like gravity. Well, there are things that scientists will have to reckon with that makes it look like an ex post facto, oh, well, see, you only did this because you knew that that was not going to work. Well, no, we reconcile it that way because we can't get rid of gravity. Mm-hmm. So if we're going to let the Bible speak and the church fathers speak and the ecumenical councils speak, and yet we also know that there's this aspect of the papacy where God has thought he was pleased to allow mm-hmm. the human capacity to be the human capacity. Well, then we draw a distinction. Mm-hmm. We draw a distinction on modes, on modality, and so that's not making it up. That's trying to maintain the foundation and not cutting it up from under our feet, right. while also being real to the facts. Mm. So it's not making it up as we go, because we're built upon something that's already unmistakably there. Mm. And if they would say, well, no, it's mistakenly there, okay, well, then we can have that discussion of why we think it's unmistakably there. Yeah.
So I want to get to, with the last few kind of main questions on parts of the book, just the conclusions that you lay out near the end. And what I really appreciate about you listing the conclusions, and you even list, in the beginning of the book, the 4 claims you're trying to substantiate, is that it makes it really clear for the reader what you're arguing. And for somebody with a philosophy background, I can't tell you how much I appreciate that, because sometimes you're reading a philosophical paper, an argument, and you're like, wait, what was the argument? And you got to fish for the thesis. At the end of your book, you lay out several conclusions. And I just want to read numbers 5 and then number 6. Yeah. But I want to, say 5 and then let you comment on it, and then 6.
Yeah.
So, and these just really stood out to me. So number 5 says this: after the schism between Latins and Greeks, the Eastern Orthodox scarcely continued with the same ecclesiological principles of Petrine primacy that were unmistakably upheld by historic Rome throughout the first millennium, manifestly demonstrating a clear mark of discontinuity. And then you go on to say, this is principally shown in 2 ways. A, the basis upon which current day Orthodox bases the primacy of Constantinople, and B, the wholesale rejection of a universal primacy of jurisdiction with governing prerogatives by Orthodoxy's largest body, the Russian Orthodox Church. So even in that in itself, there's a lot to unpack. But what I want to get at is that you're basically saying that what happened after the schism was, for the Orthodox at least, a radical discontinuity.
Yes, I say this because, and I explained in the chapter there, is that, the Orthodox are wont to admit that Rome for the first 10 centuries was a leader in the faith. By and large, they say, well, Honorius and okay, but besides Honorius and Vigilius, typically the Orthodox have always accepted the Apostolic See as a bulwark of orthodoxy, which means that that's their ancestral primacy. If Rome was the lead church, right, Orthodox? Yes. Okay, so if Rome was the lead primate in the Orthodox Church, then that means that the Roman primacy of the first millennium is your ancestral primacy. Yes. Okay, so then that means that the kind of primacy you have in the second millennium has to match your ancestral primacy. Well, yeah, but they're different. Do you see what I'm saying? Yeah. So that's the point. That's the point of that whole section.
Yeah, I mean, and of course, you talk about, and I've been keeping up even myself with the issues with the ecumenical patriarch of Constantinople and the Russian Orthodox Church. So
yeah, that gets into the weeds a little bit. The readers are just going to have to go through that. I don't know how to summarize that. There's just so much there to talk about.
So let me then get to conclusion number 6. And I think this one's really interesting, especially for my listeners who are interested in like Joshua Sijuati's work, the a priori argument in defending the papacy.
Right.
They might resonate with this. So here's number 6, conclusion 6. The visible unity of the church is best preserved by a monarchical form of government as the principle of administrative unity, where there exists one supreme judge to whom all questions on faith or discipline are referred amidst the impending threats of theological division and schism. The lack of a unifying head renders the Orthodox Church nearly incapable, that's a qualification, nearly incapable of
Right.
convening a successful pan-Orthodox council universally binding on all the baptized. Because of this, the Orthodox Church still does not have a supremely authoritative defense of its severance from the Apostolic See of Rome, nor does it appear that such a council can be upheld without the Pope. So there's a lot going on here, but I think in the last sentence, I think has the most punch. So
Yeah.
maybe you want to go there or even talk
Yeah.
about maybe monarchy. Yeah.
Yeah. So, this is really coming close to home with the Anglican objections to the papacy as well, because the Orthodox, by and large today, they do believe there is a primacy according to canonical assignment, right? But when it comes to pan-Orthodox commandments, there is not one figure that they allow that they put that into the power. That no one person, patriarch, supreme patriarch, whatever you call it, not one person has the right to have a pan-Orthodox commandment where they can issue it and then everybody has to abide by it. So this idea of the episcopal government, or the bishops, the body of bishops governing the church, having the supreme power to govern the church, in order for that supreme power to exhibit itself or to come alive in some way, it requires the willful cooperation of each part.
Mm-hmm.
And so if you have an unwilling, one of them is unwilling to participate, then that sort of wrecks the chance for there to be a pan-Orthodox command. And so what that does is it kind of paralyzes the ability for the church to address itself in a meaningful way practically, because it has to wait. And I mean, if we're talking in hundreds of years and centuries, you're going to find times where the Orthodox got together. The Palamite synods, the Synod of Jassy, the Synod of Jerusalem. But for goodness sake, I mean, if we're going to be that generous, we could talk about the synods and congregations of the Reformed Baptists. We could talk about the synods of the Presbyterians. We could talk about the conferences in the Lambeth Conference of the Church of England, and the councils that have existed today in some of the continuing Anglican forms. So just getting together in a council and then eventually agreeing on something doesn't exhibit what we're talking about here, a principled form of apostolic government that can plan, meet, and execute something. It seems to me, I agree with St. Thomas, that the monarchical view, which is also tempered, it's balanced by other forms of government in one. It's not just one pure monarchy.
Right. Not a dictatorship.
Right. But still, that there is one figure that can issue a pan-Orthodox command. We believe that is in the hands of St. Peter's successor. That has been effective, in addressing pan-Orthodox concerns. And even Metropolitan Callistus Ware lamented when he said that this recent pan-Orthodox synod that was held in Crete in 2016, that was 100 years in preparation. The reason why it took that long is because they could never get all of the people to have a consensus on when, where, how, and what to talk about. And of course, I don't want to be unfair. Of course, some of the tragic wars and persecutions that took place in the 1900s, God forbid I don't mention them. Okay. But he lamented that. Callistus lamented that. And then he contrasted it. He said, now look at John the 23rd. In the 1960s, when he planned an ecumenical council, it was called and then it was held.
Mm-hmm.
And so he wasn't, he's an Orthodox voice. So I'm taking from an Orthodox voice here. I'm not trying to, I'm taking from a well-respected scholar who for decades has been writing in the world of Orthodox ecclesiology. Even he says this is showing a clear difference in the ecclesiology between Catholics and Orthodox. And so, in that last sentence there about the Orthodox Church has not justified its severance from the Apostolic See of Rome, that is for two reasons. The first is, how did the Church address Arius? How did the Church address the stories? How did the Church address Eutychius? How did the Church address Macarius of Antioch for the Monothelites or the Iconoclasts? They all met in an ecumenical council and they issued an ecumenical anathema of those errors and the persons who held those errors. Mm. So the question is, if the Orthodox Church today is still vitally operative, just like it was in the first millennium, then where is the ecumenical anathema of the Filioque way, of the Papacy? They haven't had one yet. So they, in a sense, they've not really officially addressed the Catholic Church in the way they addressed the Arian Church or the Nestorian Church or the Monothelite Church or the Iconoclastic Church. And that is, to me, it's an indication that there's some substantial element that they had there in the first millennium, which they don't have today. Mm. And so it's something to think about. The second part is that the reason that they're having such a hard time getting ecumenical activity into high gear is because, and some of them even admit this, it is because that there's no union with the chief see. Mm. And you've seen, I even cite Orthodox scholars in the book that even admit that. So it's not something that just me, as an anti-Orthodox voice, I'm just trying to be faithful to the data here. Mm-hmm. This is something that the Orthodox have also referenced. And if you doubt me on that, just read the essay in Meyendorff's volume, The Primacy of Peter, by Father Nicholas Afanasieff, Russian Orthodox historian, historical theologian. He even admits that this is why the Orthodox have not had a council, is because there's no power of unification. Mm. The power of unification can't be residing in each part of the whole,
right?
Because if it's in each part of the whole, then the unification influence there is each to his own. Mm. So the power of unification has to be a subset of some sort, and I think that subset being a monarch, in this case with the St. Peter's headship, is what not only what works logically and a priori to mm-hmm. satisfy what's his name,
Joshua Sijuwadi.
Yeah, mm-hmm. to satisfy. I don't want to discredit that at all. That certainly has its place, absolutely. But it also matches what we see in history as well. Right. So that's the other thing I bring to the book.
Well, Eric, I got one last question for you. And yeah. I know that you list out at the end of your book, like the conclusions that you come to, but maybe just in terms of a broad kind of, you don't have to be as academically precise as you are in the book, but like, what are some conclusions that you would want a competent reader of your book to leave with? Let's say that, it's an Orthodox person might not ultimately be convinced. Yeah. But let's say what would you want them to leave with? Like what kind of nuance, if you will?
Yeah. So what I'd like for the readers to see, whether they're Orthodox, Protestant, Catholic, or atheist or unbeliever, mm-hmm. Is that the papacy is rooted in the sources of scripture, tradition, and the consensus pattern. Mm. What the implications of that are, they have to decide, but it at least show them that, wow, this is not some late medieval invention that was brought in through some infiltration of, Greek Hellenistic Platonism and, medieval scholastic speculation. Mm-hmm. No, this is historically rooted in the very voices of Jerome, Augustine, Cyprian, Stephen, and all these characters that, their memory cannot be forgotten. you know, and so the papacy is there. And, you know, so I think that an Orthodox might say, well, you know, I'm not convinced by what Ybarra says, his conclusions, but I am much more educated now about where these things are historically than I was before. And perhaps I got some work to do, you know. And the Protestant might say, well, you know, I thought the papacy was a medieval invention too, but heck, you know, it seems like it's got to run, it's a runner up in the race here, you know. So, you know, and then the Catholic, I would say, you know, the Catholic can go back and say, look, I don't, you know, I can actually know that these claims were made and accepted, and here's where that happened and how that happened. So it's just a fun place to, you know, see where your faith was in the past.
You know, Eric, your book reminds me of when I got my first copy of On Guard by William Lane Craig when I was a young Christian, because it was the first time that you had someone, at least in my life, and for many Christians, I suppose, who had someone very clearly, simply, accessibly lay out 5 arguments for the existence of God, if I remember properly in that volume. And, you know, Craig talked about how he wanted it to be the case that Christians on the street, if they were asked, why do you believe in God? They could say, oh, here's the Kalam, here's the resurrection, here's fine tuning. And I think with your book, what it's going to help a lot of Catholics be able to do is when they're asked the question, why do you believe the papal claims, you know, maybe by an Orthodox or even by a Protestant who's like, show me in the councils and the fathers, then they can say Maximus the Confessor, Athanasius, Pope Agatho, right? And of the ecumenical councils. So I think what you've done here is truly monumental. I think you, Eric, you've gotten us into the golden age of Catholic apologetics. If maybe that might be too big of a claim, but you've definitely solidified us in the golden age. Let's say that.
Well, I'm glad to be of any service that I can possibly be. You know, obviously, I wrote the book mainly for my children. You know, so I wanted my children to have something of my research, what took 10 years of my life to gain, and which is going to float off when my memory fades. Here's a documented version of that education. And then if they want to, you know, pick up where I left off, they're free to do so. But now that a wider audience is given access through the mercy and grace of Scott Hahn and St. Paul's Center for Biblical Theology, I'm just so grateful that other people are going to be able to read it. And like I've said before, I welcome dialogue. If there are Orthodox out there who read this and say, you know what, he's got some things wrong, and we need to address that, I would like to be addressed, and I've extended the opportunity for others to you know, have a discussion on it.
Eric, that's such a beautiful closing, and I just want to say to my audience, definitely buy this book if you can. The Papacy: Revisiting the Debate Between Catholics and Orthodox, a wonderful volume. Eric, you deserve every cent and penny and dollar that comes out your way, but also just all the work and the hour that you put into it. And let's see, you have a YouTube channel. I think it's Classical Christian Thought. Where else can we find your work?
Yeah, Classical Christian Thought on YouTube. I have 2 websites, erickybarra.com. And then that's just a website for projects I've got in the making. erickybarra.org is my blog. That's where you can go and read some of, you know, my ramblings. You know? And then, you know, that's it. I'm on a lot of other shows nowadays. I need to pay attention more to my own show. But yeah, you could just see me on YouTube. I've been on Reason and Theology. I've been here on Intellectual Catholicism and other channels as well. So yeah, and feel free to find me on Facebook as well.
And you have your academia page too.
Oh yeah. Academia.edu. Yep.
All right. Well, Eric, thank you for this interview tonight. And thank you for the hard work that you put in to make this book awesome.
Oh, the pleasure's all here. I appreciate that. You're very kind.